And now, the survival show that once survived weaponized Ebola, anthrax, cobra venom. In this episode, we sit down with Paul Martin. He's going to share with us lessons in making preparedness a full-contact community sport and practical things preppers often overlook while being distracted by the more exciting yet unlikely scenarios. Howdy, and welcome to In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 164. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Paul, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
Thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
And we're both enjoying this last, spurt of cool air here in Texas.
Yes, we will be longing for this here in a couple of months when it's 105 and 85% humidity all at the same time outside. So enjoy it while we can.
Exactly. Well, it's good to have you on. I know we spoke, we did a show together on the other podcast I was doing for a while, which that podcast was more on security and personal security and home security and stuff. So we really didn't get too much into the preparedness stuff. But today I think we're going to have a good time and come at this this whole conversation from a stronger preparedness. But let's start with, for the audience that doesn't already know who you are, how did you come to preparedness?
Well, everyone has their own story, and my story started basically when I was 4 or 5 years old, and a severe storm rolled through my neighborhood to the point that my mother, who was babysitting myself and my 1-year-old brother at the time, and a friend of mine who were eating lunch, she rushed us into the hallway as she saw the next door neighbor's front porch fly over our house and it land in our backyard.
Wow.
And I suspect many people would have been terrified by that. And at 5 years old, I didn't know I was supposed to be scared. I was fascinated with the whole thing. And my mom and I remember as a kid, we went outside and we started picking up our neighbors' belongings and putting them in our garage for safekeeping until they came home. And I was just floored by how much damage that storm did. And growing up in a rural area in Tennessee, it was fairly common that we would have power outages. The water would go out because you live in the middle of nowhere. And so things that people take for granted today were fairly common in rural Tennessee back in the 70s and 80s. Fast forward to my sophomore year of high school, we live out in the country. My next door neighbors, and when I say next door neighbor out in the country, these people were probably, at that point, maybe a half mile away. Their house burned down in the middle of the night. The volunteer firefighters came. My dad and I came into the scene, and we tried to help as much as we could. And it really struck me that people need to be better prepared until help arrives. Fast forward through college and then to law school. I started law school at the University of Miami. I had never been to Miami in my life until I moved into my apartment to start school. And that was a week before Hurricane Andrew arrived.
Oh,
and our school was delayed about 3 weeks because we had both students and professors who lost everything as a result of that storm. And it was at that point when I said to myself that I'm never going to put myself in a position where I am fearful of damage and fearful of the impact storms can make because I'm not prepared. I may be fearful because of the severity, but I don't want to be unnecessarily afraid because I wasn't prepared and my family wasn't prepared to deal with what was coming. And so that's when I started this journey. That would have been 1992, 93. And I started this journey, and like a lot of people who've gotten into this, I've made a lot of mistakes along the way. I've purchased things that on hindsight I probably didn't need to purchase. I didn't take training that I probably should have early on. And so now at this point in my life and in my preparedness journey, one of the things I like to do is to share the benefits of my failures and things and mistakes I've made and successes I've had along the way as well, so that people can get up to speed more quickly as opposed to having to endure the setbacks and the long road to better preparedness without all the errors that some of us have had along the way.
You know, you brought up a really interesting point there about things you shouldn't have bought or classes or training you should have taken early on. Out of curiosity, what is your kind of off the cuff list of things you wish you'd gotten training in early on that you later went back and realized, oh, this was actually more important than whatever other pile of prepper poo I did in the beginning? What was yours?
Yeah. So one of the things I've come up with over the years are what I call the 6 axioms of preparedness. And one of those axioms is to execute the basics well. So for example, many people will go out and they will buy lots of guns and ammo, but then they won't learn how to use it properly.
Yeah.
And they'll buy other things. And so to answer your question, I still have, and I keep these things to this day, I still have a surplus chem suit post 9/11, still in its original package. I've never taken it out of the package, in part because I'm afraid of what I'll find when it's in there. This probably belongs in the Smithsonian as opposed to any sort of preparedness supplies I have, but I still have it. I bought lots and lots of MREs because, Aaron, I didn't know any better.
Mm-hmm.
This was probably late 90s, pre 9 or not 9/11, but pre Y2K, and we did not have the resources, and we didn't have things like YouTube, and we didn't have blogs, and we didn't have podcasts like your show where people could go and learn how to do this effectively. We were sort of pioneers in many respects of those people who lived in urban or suburban areas who wanted to be better prepared, who didn't raise their own food because they didn't live in the country, and who had some storage space but not a lot. And so we were making this up in many respects from long ago. And so I had all sorts of little items, radioactive detectors, Geiger counter type stuff, and it was surplus, and the stuff may or may not have worked. I never bothered to have it tested. Looking back on that, while I could appreciate, particularly after 9/11, why this stuff would have been of interest, because every time you turned on the news, it was buy your duct tape and plastic sheeting at Home Depot and create a safe room in your house because Al-Qaeda is going to come to your neighborhood in middle of nowhere America and release weaponized Ebola, anthrax, cobra venom, or whatever thing they concocted that week to scare us with.
Yes.
And I mean, we just didn't know. And so the benefit of the people who are preparing now, who are just getting started, and they say they feel overwhelmed. I say, I understand you feel overwhelmed because there's so much information. It's so much easier now to get prepared and make good decisions about preparedness than it was for us 15, 20 years ago when we were literally making this up as we went along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point. There are a lot more resources, but what's funny is I think people coming into preparedness often still fall for the same stuff. And even when we've been in preparedness, when things happen, it's easy, even when we know better and we've been in it for a decade or two or more, to still get kind of whipped into a lather about things. I remember when, speaking of Ebola, when Ebola was out, man, I was a hair away from buying a chemical attack suit. And I thought, I know better. I shouldn't do this. And we had gone through the CERT stuff, and it came up in CERT. We were talking about, they were like, yeah, the chemical suits are cool, but they're only good if you actually have a decontamination unit standing by ready to scrub you down, because as soon as you try to take off that suit, you're going to get whatever was on that suit on your skin, and so the suit was worthless.
That's right.
And I think the other thing, too, is people don't realize how miserable those things are. I mean, just as for example, I ended up actually buying some of the Tyvek suits recently because I was running a new network through a new house. And so I was up in the attic in winter for Texas winter, but still winter, for 4 days. And I was sweating my butt off, and it was hot and miserable, and the stupid things kept tearing. And I thought, man, if there really was a situation where I needed one of these things, I'd be dead. Just end of story. I would be dead, because this is not working out well.
Oh, so after I bought my chem suit, I'm sitting at lunch one day and I'm talking to my coworkers about this. And one of my coworkers was, at the time, an Army reservist and a colonel. And she had done a deployment to Iraq. And I'm telling her about this chem suit, and she's snickering. And she says, so what do you know about this chem suit? Because she'd actually had training, unlike me, on how this is supposed to work. And so I said, well, it's in a neat little bag, and I'm going to put it on whenever we have a risk of some sort of biological chemical threat. And she says, you understand that you'll probably be wearing that suit for 2 to 3 days and before you take it off. And I said, really? And I said, well, how do you go to the bathroom? And she just looked at me. And I said, oh, really? Well, all of a sudden the utility of that suit dropped dramatically for me. I thought, if things are really that bad, then perhaps I need to come up with a different plan as opposed to wearing this surplus chemical suit that I'm not even sure works at this point.
Oh, man, too funny. Well, Paul, let's take a quick break for this message. Listeners, visit itrh.net. In the Rabbit Hole does what it does for you and stays on the air through support from listeners just like you. Supporting members also get all kinds of extra bonuses and great membership benefits. Learn more and become part of the In the Rabbit Hole Roving Horde Armada today by visiting itrh.net. Do it today. Now, back to Paul. Now, when we spoke a while back, you brought up that you are a lobbyist in the insurance industry. And one of the other things we brought up was that there's actually a lot of things that, whether people like insurance or not, and their feelings about it, there are actually a lot of things the insurance industry does in self-interest, for good cause, that actually nudges the preparedness as a whole, we'll say, to some degree or another. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So when we talk about preparedness in an insurance context, we generally use the term or terms mitigation and resiliency. And studies show that depending on whose numbers you use, but as a generally accepted rule, for every dollar we spend in mitigation efforts, we save $8 in claims. So, for example, when we build homes that are built to a stronger building code if they are in a disaster-prone area, such as someplace near the coast where there's a tropical storm risk, hurricane risk, or if you live in a place like, for example, here in Texas, where places in the Metroplex, places in the Panhandle up into Oklahoma have significant hail risk. When you build with those risks in mind, what we find is that we pay less in claims as an industry. When that happens, we can then start to see from an actuary standpoint that can have a downward pressure on premiums. And that's a fancy way of saying if we just build better homes, we can start to see some insurance savings in terms of premiums long term. So, for example, if you went and replaced your roof right now and you said, rather than using the standard shingles, I'm going to use hail-resistant shingles, I will tell you that at least when we did that on our house, the recapture period on the extra expense in terms of premium savings is about 7 years. So you can actually save money on insurance premiums by building with safety and resilience in mind. Right now, my wife and I are building a house. We are incorporating a lot of disaster features and resiliency features into the house. We are putting a sprinkler system, fire sprinkler system in the house.
Wow.
We are putting a FEMA designed safe room in the house. We are building to hurricane code so that when we have high winds here in the Austin area, that reduces the risk that the roof will come off. And as a result, we expect to see fairly significant insurance savings on our premiums fairly quickly. And to the point that it won't be that long before those additional upgrades pay for themselves in insurance savings and in terms of maintenance savings as well, because you're building a stronger, more durable home. Most people think that if they have to do these sorts of things, that's going to be very costly. And particularly if you're building the house with these things in mind, the delta, the additional cost of that are pretty slim. So that's one thing that we advocate in the insurance industry is building with resiliency and mitigation in mind. Now, there's a second piece to this as well that's not necessarily about mitigation, but it goes back to what I said earlier about executing the basics well. You and I know people who would gladly spend $1,500 on a new tricked-out AR-15 with some really cool mags and plenty of ammo for it, and yet they don't have basic life insurance. They don't have a will. They don't have those basic things that you need to do. And I do a seminar, a conference every year in Austin in January on preparedness. And I bring speakers in, but I actually spoke on the subject, and I call it In Case of Death. And I have the participants write down 3 numbers. I say, the first number I want you to write down is, what percentage chance do you think that we will have a financial collapse in the rest of your lifetime? And they'll write down that number, whatever that number is. And I say, the second number I want you to tell me is, what is the percentage chance that we will have a hurricane come through the Austin area and do significant damage? Whatever that number is, write that down. The third number is, what are the odds that you will die in your lifetime? Well, I don't know the first 2, but I do know the third. That's 100%. Mm-hmm. And so if we are preparing for the unlikely encounter with a guy who's going to rob, assault, murder us, if we're preparing for that with buying guns and ammo, then shouldn't we be preparing for the much higher risk activities, namely our own death, and making sure that our families are squared away, that our families know where the keys are to our gun safe, and they know what the passwords are to our credit card account so they can get those paid off. And so you can use insurance as a way to mitigate that risk as well, because so many people, and I'm sure you've known these people, particularly preppers, when they take the big ride and they check out of life here on Earth, and the inheritance they leave to their family is a closet full of MREs, guns, and ammo, that's not much of an inheritance, especially if you have a lot of debt that you haven't paid off because you were so focused on preparing for a disaster, which that's good that you were preparing for disaster, but you weren't taking care of the basics along the way. Mm-hmm. And so that's where insurance can also play a role in terms of having life insurance and long-term care insurance and those sorts of things, disability insurance, so that when the more likely scenario happens, you can manage that risk as well.
Mm-hmm. So, and you mentioned some of the basics, and this isn't really where I intended to take it, but now I'm really curious. I guess let's unpack that a little bit more as far as what kind of insurance people actually should have, and when it becomes a point of it's too much insurance and you're just kind of spending money willy-nilly on something.
Sure. And so the first key to all this is make sure you find an insurance agent that is knowledgeable and that you trust. Not everyone needs life insurance. I work in the insurance field. I don't have a lick of life insurance. I don't need life insurance because I don't have any kids of my own. I have a stepdaughter. She's 18. Her mom has life insurance. She's taken care of. I don't have a lot of debt. My pickup truck is 10 years old and paid for. So it's not like there's a whole lot of things to pay for when I leave. I do have a will, and so that when I check out, my assets will transfer to my wife, and there's money there to pay off any credit card bill that I've left unpaid. So you have to make sure that you find an insurance agent who you trust and that will actually sell you products that you need as opposed to things you don't. So I'll just use myself as an example. I do have a disability policy, which is, you think about the Aflac commercial where you get injured and it's not a hospital bills or doctor's bills policy. It pays you income while you can't work. That's called disability insurance.
Okay.
And, the way that it was explained to me when I first bought it was, if you had a machine in your basement that made $50,000 a year, would you buy insurance for it? Yeah, I would. And that's where most people are. If you have any income at all, you can buy disability insurance. And disability insurance is not all that expensive. It gets more expensive as you get older, but if you're a younger person, and particularly if you buy it when you're younger, it's really not that expensive. Then there's long-term care insurance, and that pays for if you have to go to a nursing home. And no one likes to think about that, but I encourage you to look and do your own research. Right now, a nursing home stay will cost you around $200, $225 a day. And you may be there for months, if not years. Do you and your family have resources to pay for that? Are you going to have to sell your house to pay for you or your spouse's nursing home stay? Now, as you get older, things like Medicare can kick in and help with that. But at the same time, if it happens to you when you're younger, you may be liquidating college funds. You may be liquidating 401ks and savings just to pay for your nursing home stay. And so I always encourage people to consider getting long-term care. And then the final one is just life insurance. And again, life insurance is not for everyone. And some people buy life insurance. They'll buy universal life or whole life as an investment. And what I tell people is you may not need that. You may just need a very basic term life insurance policy, which may not be that expensive, so that if you, particularly if you have minor kids or a spouse that doesn't work, if you check out of here prematurely when you're 40 or 45 and you've got kids at home, that there's some money there to help pay off the mortgage and help send the kids to college so that they aren't struggling when you leave. Now, I know that's boring and preppers don't like to talk about insurance. I mean, come on, man, let's talk about guns and ammo and night vision equipment and all the cool stuff that we're supposed to talk about. A closet full of that stuff will be worthless to your family if you leave early. And guess what? None of us make it out of here alive.
That is very, very true. So now you've written 2 books, but one that is readily available to most people, which is, Pivot Points, Creating a Culture of Preparedness and Resiliency in America. And I guess people can guess a lot from the title, but walk us through it. What is the book about, and what was your end goal for the book?
So I was a blogger for a number of years, and I still blog at my website, prepperdepot.org. I had a different website at the time, and I was blogging, and I just started writing essays about preparedness. And sometimes I would post them as blog entries, and sometimes I would just create a Word document and leave it on my computer. And one day I started going through all these essays I had written about preparedness and just kind of my thoughts on various subjects within preparedness. And I realized, this might make for a decent book. Pivot Points is not necessarily a how to become a prepper. It's about creating a culture of preparedness. And I start with the premise that the preparedness movement in America has failed. And a lot of people like to challenge me on that. And I say, well, when we see that people were not prepared for Hurricane Katrina, when people are not prepared for Hurricane Rita, people were not prepared for Superstorm Sandy. They weren't prepared for the ice storm 2 or 3 years ago in Georgia where people got snowed in and Chick-fil-A was having to cook dinner for people on the side of the interstate. Back this winter, we had people who were stuck on the interstate in Pennsylvania in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of a blizzard. And I say to you, if preparedness is becoming more mainstream, then we wouldn't have these things happening over and over and over again. And so while it's becoming a little less odd to be a prepper these days, we aren't converting people into the preparedness movement, to preparedness lifestyle fast enough. And so I suggest that we need to reboot our thinking on creating a culture of preparedness and figure out a way where we take the stigma away from it and we make preparedness more of an obligation of good citizenship rather than a symptom of a mental illness. Because that's where I think we are in the movement right now. 10 years ago, when you told people you were preparing, people laughed at me. At least they did for me. They laughed at me. They thought I was some nut job. Many of those same people now come to me and ask me how they can get better prepared. So we're trending in the right direction, but we're not moving there fast enough.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point there. And America as a nation, maybe a generation or perhaps even 2 generations ago, was fairly prepared, and it was not crazy. I mean, that was you were a good citizen if you were prepared. A lot of that was really more, I think, wartime thinking than anything. Not that we haven't been in a war that doesn't seem to want to ever stop, but why do you think the majority of Americans, even still today, still view preppers and people who prepare as nuts?
Well, I think a large part of that is the fact that technology has been both a blessing and a curse. So, for example, we don't have to worry about having access to food and water like we may have done 40, 50, 60 years ago if you lived in a rural environment. Most of us live in a suburban or urban environment, and we have the internet, and we have grocery stores that are open 18, 24 hours a day. We have these things that when I run out of something, I just run to my store and pick it up, as opposed to buying things and keeping things on hand for periods of time because we may not be going to the grocery store. Maybe the grocery store is not going to be open at night or on the weekend when we need something. And so we thought better of that, and we thought better of being prepared. So, just as an example of something that happened here yesterday in my neighborhood, the local power provider had sent out a letter a couple weeks ago saying we're going to have a power outage in your neighborhood for about 5 hours as we do some upgrades on the systems, and so prepare yourself accordingly. Some people didn't bother to read the letter. And they, in the middle of the day, they were outside their house wondering why the power is off. I guess they thought maybe an EMP had hit. Or if they even knew what that meant, I don't know. And then when the power did not come back on in the time prescribed, it was starting to get dark here. And my neighbors were fretting, like, how am I going to see in my house? And so I went upstairs and I pulled out some Goal Zero lights that I had purchased in bulk. And I started distributing those to my neighbors. And I say, here's how you wind it up when the battery runs out, and here's how you use the LED function. So you at least have some light to be able for your kids to do their homework, or for you to see through your house if the power doesn't come back on. And, I talked about those 6 axioms. And one of those things is, I like to say is, I'm crazy until I'm not.
Yeah.
And by I mean that is, people think you're nuts for having a stockpile of Goal Zero lights that you can charge either through solar panels or charge by winding. But last night around 6:30 p.m., Paul looked pretty sane when he was able to hand those lights out to neighbors so that they could see their way through the house at night. And so it's just a matter of rebooting our thinking that preparedness is not necessarily a hobby. It is not necessarily a sign that you are crazy or that you're unstable, but rather this is an obligation that people should do. And so the book Pivot Points, the title is about finding your pivot point, finding that thing that motivates you to prepare, with the understanding that what motivates you to prepare may be different than what motivates me to prepare, and that's okay. We don't have to have the same motivation as long as we get to the same place, and that is when the power goes out or there's a storm or there's, God forbid, civil unrest, you and I both are prepared to weather that storm for a period of time.
So now, to kind of circle back to something you were saying a second ago, preparedness is good citizenship. Let's unpack that. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, I devote a chapter in Pivot Points to that subject, and I start that chapter by saying good preparedness is good citizenship. And when we think about good citizenship, what are some qualities and some descriptors that come to mind? Well, it's people who pick up litter and they vote and they're courteous in public and they're knowledgeable about what's going on in the news and they participate in charitable activities. They do the things that make the community better. If you and I are prepared so that first responders and charitable organizations don't have to help us and can instead focus on those people who were not prepared for one reason or another, then we have lessened the burden on law enforcement, on medical first responders, on firefighters. We have reduced the burden on food banks and the Red Cross and other aid organizations so that those organizations can focus on people who are in truly need of assistance. And again, I may get prepared because my faith dictates that I do it. I may be prepared because I don't want my family to suffer. But we can all be good citizens. And I go through the book and I give you 30 ways to improve your citizenship, because I think that is what's so important in preparedness, is that when we look at preparedness, we think of it not necessarily as an individual sport. And I think that's one of the issues that's really held us back as a movement. We think of preparedness as an individual sport. That is the wrong mentality. And that's a mentality, to be honest, I held that mentality for a long time. And then I realized that was very short-sighted and, dare I say it, selfish of me to say. We need to be putting ourselves in a position to be leaders in the community to help with that rebuilding process, and preparedness is one way we do that. What thing has really heartened me when I do more reading and watch more podcasts like this and I attend more conferences is we have clearly seen a shift in the thinking of the preparedness movement, particularly with the leaders of the preparedness movement, away from preparedness as an individual sport, get your stuff ready, and if your neighbors aren't ready, too bad. Because that's been our mantra for a long time. In the last 5 years, particularly in the last year and a half, I have really noticed a change in the attitude of the leaders and the thought leaders of this movement, that this is a community response. that communities come together. And I think in large part, it's become out of necessity, because I think we now have realized when we have people like the FEMA director, Craig Fugate, coming out and telling people, look, FEMA is ready. We are working. Understand, it may be a while before we get to you. It's just the sheer nature of disaster response. The ultimate response, the best response, is a community-based response. Mm-hmm. And we can build stronger communities. And this is being tested and proven right now. We build stronger communities when we have community-based preparedness organizations and community-based preparedness efforts. So, for example, you think about the Rockefeller Foundation and their 100 Resilient Cities. I think it's the program they've called. And they've put seed money into various cities around the globe to create disaster response efforts that are entirely community-based. One of those cities is San Francisco. Okay, so San Francisco, huge earthquake risk compared to the rest of the country. And you think of San Francisco, one of the first things you think of, yes, politically it's left of center, lots of government services relying on the government. They have set that mentality aside. And you have these neighborhoods now to have their own emergency food and water supply set aside, completely independent of the government. The local city government has no control over it. It's community organizations and community groups that are doing this all on their own.
So is this separate from CERT then?
Completely separate from CERT.
Oh, okay.
There's no government involvement in this at all. This is truly community organizations coming together, neighborhood associations, other civic-minded groups that are not connected to the government whatsoever, and they are finding places to store food, water, first aid gear, communications supplies such as ham radios, those sorts of things, and they are taking care. They're coming up with a plan to take care of themselves and to do that personnel accountability, so that if there's a disaster in my neighborhood, that I know that me and another person are tasked with going up and down the street and checking on people and seeing if they're okay. And if we can't account for them, here's a form we fill out, and now we know who we're supposed to report to. That information is so much more helpful to law enforcement than, hey, we're all out of power and our houses are damaged on my street, come help us. And that's where we start to see the community piece of this come together, because then the disaster response works so much more efficiently. And people like you, who know a little more about preparedness than the typical person, you can be a leader and help others through that period, so that we don't have this huge drain of resources from first responders and other volunteers coming in the neighborhoods trying to help us.
Right. And so that's interesting. Like with CERT, I get, since I'm familiar with CERT and went through CERT program and everything like that, so their logistics and their mechanisms and their methods and everything else and procedures and protocols I'm familiar with. How do those communities because now I'm fascinated by this, how do those communities in San Francisco, where do they get their training and instruction and everything like that from?
Well, they'll get that from maybe CERT type training, and they may actually become CERT responders.
Okay.
But the overall effort to organize, to set supplies aside, that's not tied to CERT or any other government agency. Mm-hmm. That is being driven by locals and community groups who are doing it themselves. Because when you think of CERT, that's generally some sort of response of emergency management. The city emergency manager, maybe a function of the fire rescue or EMS. It generally has a government nexus. And while these people may be getting CERT trained, and I suspect that's a big component of it, as you know, CERT has grown in popularity dramatically. My kids' high school, they now teach CERT to a disaster class. Yeah. And so CERT has grown in popularity, but the overall driving mechanism of some of these resilient city programs that are taking place have no government funding tied to them whatsoever.
Well, that's really cool. That as an extreme libertarianist, I might say, I like that a lot better than any government involvement. So that's pretty neat. I hadn't even heard of that yet. I need to personally look into that more carefully. But I also know to pivot to one of the pivot points from your book, Pivot Points, you had a line in there about we should create a culture of preparedness in America. It's kind of a general statement, and I think a lot of us could take away from it. But for you, what does creating that culture of preparedness actually look like in America?
So it's going to look different for different people in different parts of the country. But I give some examples of what it might look like if we truly had a culture of preparedness. If you have, we'll say in Oklahoma, for example, during storm season, you have young people who've taken a disaster preparedness class in their high school, which, by the way, my kids' high school and my school district, they're actually teaching disaster preparedness classes for credit now. And it's been very exciting to watch. And some of those kids perhaps get trained as storm spotters. And so some of those kids get excited and they become ham radio operators. And so you have more people who are storm spotting and reporting damage and reporting severe weather. If you're in a more suburban or college town, college kids make sure that they have supplies ready in case their house catches on fire, their dorm catches on fire, those sorts of things. If you're a single mom and you live in a neighborhood and maybe the neighborhood has a tendency to be high crime, you're getting training in self-defense so that when seconds matter, the cops are minutes away and yet you can still deal with the problem. And so it looks different for different people, but at the end of the day, what it's about is, number one, making sure that your situation is squared away so that you can be on your own for a period of time, a week, 2 weeks, with food and water and medical supplies and prescription medications if you need them. And that, secondly, you're able to be in a position to help others. Again, I don't care what drives you. I don't care if it's your obligation of civic duty or citizenship, or that your faith requires you to do it, or you run a business and you've got 10 people on your payroll that you need to make sure can still go home and feed their families and keep their jobs as a result of after disaster. I don't care how we get there, but the pivot point for people and the cultural preparedness for people is going to look different for everyone. The goal is, as long as we have making preparedness a goal of ours, we'll create that culture on our own, and we don't have to necessarily have in order to have a cultural preparedness, we have to do 5 things, or we all must do the same 6 things. I don't know that it's necessarily that rigid. I think it's more of a holistic approach so that it's tailored to individual families and individual communities.
Okay. So what are because we've talked about community building, or we've touched on community and everything else, and of course creating that culture, marrying the two together. What are your go-to tactics for creating a culture of preparedness within a community?
Sure. No, that's really what Pivot Points is all about. So step 1 is you find your pivot point. Step 2 is you get yourself prepared. Step 3, and that's where we're really going with this, and that is creating your own preparedness service project. And there are lots of different ways you can do that. If you're a member of a homeowners association, you can invite the local fire department to come to your neighborhood one day and teach kids fire safety. If you work in a workplace that doesn't have some sort of safety team, safety committee, you can host lunch and learns where you bring your lunch and somebody does a presentation on a preparedness topic. You talk to your employers about doing more safety drills at work and making sure that employees know that if we have to shelter in place one night because of a lockdown or severe weather in the neighborhood or a chemical spill, that you have some basic snacks and some bottled water, and dare I say it, maybe even a change of clothes somewhere in your office, so that if the power is out and you have to get stuck in your office, that you can do that. You're working with your house of worship, your church, to make sure that there's continuity of services, to make sure that your fellow parishioners are taken care of. One example I use in the book that I've actually done is when my stepdaughter was much younger, she would go on week-long mission trips with our church. And the guy who was running the mission trip was a friend of mine, and I went to him and I said, if I supply you with smoke alarms to install in people's houses, that the mission was you went to houses where people who couldn't afford repairs and they made repairs. And I said, if I send some smoke alarms with you, will you install them? And he said, absolutely. And so my stepdaughter and I got 50, 60 smoke alarms, bought them in bulk. We took them out of their little boxes. We wrote a Bible verse on the back that talks about how the Lord wants you to be safe and to be prepared. And we had the kids install those smoke alarms. And so we were educating and creating a cultural preparedness within 2 groups at the same time. The high school kids that were there installing it saw their church making preparedness a priority. The recipients saw these young people coming into their house, helping them to be prepared as well. So we were educating 2 different demographics at the same time. And so creating the cultural preparedness and going about it is really limited only by your imagination. And in Pivot Points, I come up with a whole list of examples and strategies on creating a budget, how to get people in who are influential in your community involved in the process. And it's just a matter of sitting down and figuring out, okay, I feel called, or I think doing X is a good idea. How would I go about it? And I tell people, you cannot screw this up, because much of the stuff that I talk about, I was making up as I went. There's no formula for it per se. I do relay some of my experiences, successes and failures in the book to help other people in their efforts, but don't be afraid to undertake a preparedness service project because you think you're going to fail. I've done several where maybe they didn't go as well as I had hoped, and that's okay, because maybe I met someone who was also in preparedness. I made a new friend, or maybe I learned a lesson about how to do this more effectively the next time. And so that's the good part about this, is that so many people are willing to get prepared themselves, but then they won't take that next step, Aaron. They won't say, I'm going to share what I know. And they say, because I don't want to be seen as a nut job, or I don't know how, or I don't have the money to do it. Those are excuses. And we need to figure out ways around those problems so that we can become the champions of preparedness and create that culture. The good news is, what I tell people is, it's not like there's going to be an anti-preparedness lobby that's going to rise up and thwart us from teaching our kids CPR and first aid, right? And we look at other examples of culture change in America. I'm 46, and I look back in my lifetime, and I think we now have serious discussions about the decriminalization of marijuana. Interracial marriage, which was taboo in many parts of the country, is now commonplace. We have all these culture changes that have taken place. Some were very organized. Some were just rather organic and spontaneous. The good news is, because culture can be changed, we can create that culture of preparedness so that at the end of the day, we don't have people on the roofs of their house after a hurricane hits New Orleans. We don't have people stuck in their cars on a interstate in the middle of a snowstorm with no food or water. We don't have to keep repeating these same mistakes over and over and over again if we just spend a little time and a little effort setting some supplies aside, learning first aid, and being willing to help others along the way.
Paul, those are great words and powerful. I think that's a great place to leave off, man. That's a lot to take in, and I think a lot of really good stuff to take in. Dude, I want to thank you for coming on today. How can people get connected with you and stay on top of the things you're doing, and maybe even check out your book?
Sure. The website is prepperdepot.org, not .com, prepperdepot.org. I have a blog there. I have information about upcoming seminars that I'm either hosting or co-hosting, and other activities I'm working on. You can follow me there. The book is called Pivot Points. If you go on Amazon and you just type in Pivot Points, Paul Martin, it'll be probably the first hit that comes up. If any of your listeners buy a copy of the book, I'd really appreciate they leave a review on Amazon, even if it's just really short. That's what drives the algorithm for search engine results. And so that would be really helpful to me if anyone buys the book. I'd really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you again, Paul. We sure appreciate having you on today.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, for as little as $2.50 a month, you can keep this show safe and sound that helps keep you safe and sound. Visit itrh.net. In the Rabbit Hole does what it does and stays on the air through support from listeners just like you. Now, supporting members also get all kinds of extra bonuses and great membership benefits. Learn more and become part of the In the Rabbit Hole Roving Horde Armada today by visiting itrh.net. Do it today. And as always, show notes and the ability to comment on this episode can be found at intherabbithole.com/E164. And with that, we wrap up episode number 164 from the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.